His name was Ferdinand Magellan. He was born in Portugal and served at court. But when his homeland turned its back on him, he did not give up and went to the Spanish king with a daring offer to reach the east by sailing west. What made the Portuguese go over to the Spanish side? How did he convince the king to send him on a voyage where no European had set foot? Why did a mutiny break out at the very beginning of the journey? Where did he find the strait? That changed the map of the world forever? And why did Magellan himself not live to see the triumph? This video tells the whole story of the world's first round-the-world expedition. We will tell you how ships and crews perished, how sailors wandered in the silence of the Pacific Ocean, and how one single ship returned home, having accomplished the impossible. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories are published here every day. Ferdinand Magellan was born in the 80s of the 10th century in the northern part of Portugal, in the small village of Sabrosa, among vineyards, olive groves, and narrow stone roads. His family belonged to the minor nobility, noble enough to be considered people of honor, but not so rich as to provide their children with a carefree life. Father Rodrigo Magellan acted as the royal representative in the district, monitoring the collection of taxes and law and order. Mother Alda do Mesquita came from a respected local family, and thanks to the connections of her family, Ferdinand was able to receive a decent education at an early age. In the Magellan house, scholarship was respected. From childhood, the boy learned to read and write, mastered the basics of arithmetic, listened to the instructions of the local priest, studied the catechism and Latin prayers. However, his childhood was not closed in books. He helped his father with administrative duties, participated in hunting, listened to the stories of merchants and soldiers passing through the village, about distant lands rich in spices and gold, about people with different skins and other gods. These stories excited his imagination and gradually formed a thirst for distant travels. When Ferdinand was about 12 years old, his family sent him to the court of Queen Leonora, widow of King Juan II, who continued to live at the court of the new monarch, Manuel I. Here in Lisbona, young Magellan began his service as a page. This stage became an important test for him. He left his native village and found himself surrounded by the court nobility with its strict rules, refined manners, constant discussions of politics, and sea expeditions. At court, Ferdinand continued his education. He was taught fencing, horse riding, geography, astronomy, navigation, and the basics of cartography, sciences that were especially important in Portugal during the time of the great geographical discoveries. In those years, Lisbon lived by the sea. The harbor was filled with sails, markets, spices, and silks, and the court with talk of overseas possessions. Bartolomeus had already rounded the Wee with good hope. Vasco da Gama reached India, and King Manuel dreamed of Portugal becoming the mistress of the Indian Ocean. The young Pasha, although not belonging to the influential nobility, absorbed with interest everything that concerned navigation, and, according to contemporaries, showed particular perseverance and attention to detail. Having reached the age of 25, Magellan entered military and naval service. He was included in the flotilla, which was led by Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. This armada was equipped with special care. It was intended not only to protect the interests of the crown in India, but also to lay the foundations for a permanent military presence in the region. The flotilla crossed the Atlantic, sailed around Africa, past Mozambique and Zanzibar, and finally reached the western coast of Hindustan. Here, Magellan's first real trials began. He took part in naval skirmishes with Moorish ships, accompanied trade caravans along the coast of Malabar, guarded trading posts in Kannur and Cochin, served in garrisons, and with each passing year, he increasingly understood that real power in these territories belonged to those who knew how to manage the fleet. Later in 1510, Magellan again set off for India, this time as part of the expedition of Afonso d'Albuquerque, an energetic and ruthless strategist who subjugated Goa and turned it into the capital of Portuguese India. The campaign in Malacca became especially important for Magellan. The city, which controlled the trade routes between China, Java, and India, was a key point. The assault on Malacca was difficult. The Portuguese encountered fierce resistance. The streets were barricaded, and the battle was house to house. During the battle, Magellan was wounded in the leg by a spear, an injury that, according to chroniclers, accompanied him for the rest of his life, and could have been the cause of his limp. According to his fellow soldiers, he showed himself to be brave and cool, not losing his composure even in the most intense moments of the battle. For his participation in this campaign, he was rewarded, received slaves, part of the trophies, and formal gratitude from the command, but not a promotion. Returning to Portugal a year later, Magellan was already a veteran of 3 expeditions to India, with combat experience, knowledge of navigation, and his own ideas about colonial policy. However, at court, his merits were undervalued. His salaries were cut, and no new appointments were offered. And when he asked for a promotion and the due compensation for his service in Malacca, he was refused. It was then that a sense of injustice arose in him, a feeling that his efforts were not needed in his own country. When Magellan returned to Portugal in 1513, after participating in military campaigns in India and Southeast Asia, he already had considerable combat and naval experience. He proved himself to be an officer, capable, disciplined, and reliable. However, upon returning to his homeland, he found neither gratitude nor promotion nor interest in his merits. Instead of recognition, Magellan was met with indifference. King Manuel I, although he continued to actively develop Portuguese expansion in Asia, preferred to entrust key commands to representatives of the high nobility, rather than officers from provincial families who did not have influential patrons. For Magellan, who came from an impoverished noble family and was not particularly favored at court, this meant a de facto exclusion from further participation in overseas politics. The conflict intensified in 1514 when Magellan went to Morocco as part of a military company and was wounded during a sortie. Upon his return, he filed a petition for an increase in pay for his wound and was forced to appeal to various authorities several times to obtain compensation. At the same time, he found himself involved in a dispute regarding the supply of horses. His actions were interpreted as a violation of orders. The investigation did not reveal any direct guilt, but the fact of the proceedings itself became the basis for a cooling of relations between him and the court bureaucracy. Magellan tried to defend his name. He filed a petition, represented evidence of his service. He cited his military achievements at Malacca, but his voice was weak among many influential rivals. After another refusal in 1517, he took a decision that few dared to make at the time: leave Portugal and offer his services to the Spanish crown, Lisbon's main rival on the sea routes. He did not do it publicly. He did not issue a challenge, did not deliver an accusatory speech. He simply left the capital where he had ceased to be noticed for Seville, where a new phase of his life was beginning. There in Andalusia, he became part of a foreign but rapidly developing maritime power, where talk was increasingly about how to break Portugal's monopoly on the eastern routes. He was not alone in Seville. He was joined by another Portuguese, the scientist and astronomer Rui Faleiro, a man of a harsh disposition, but with a brilliant knowledge of navigation and cosmography. Together, they began to develop a project for an expedition that they both hoped would interest the court of Castile. The gist of the project was as follows. According to the Treaty of Torre de Celas, Spain had no right to sail east toward India, that zone having been ceded by Portugal. But if the Maluku Islands could be reached from the west, by going around the New World, and if they could be proven to be in the Castile sphere of influence, the Spanish monarch could lay claim to a share of the Asian trade without directly violating the treaty. The project was daring, but not fantastic. Its implementation required not only a fleet, but also legal justification, precise astronomical calculations, and, most importantly, the favor of the crown. The first step was to appeal to Juan de Randa, an influential official from Castile Castación, an institution that organized maritime expeditions. Oranda listened carefully to Magellan and Falero, saw in their proposal a chance to seize the initiative from Portugal, and agreed to help them present the plan to Carlos I. In early 1518, Magellan went to Valladolid, where the young Spanish king was then staying. Carlos I, although only 18 years old, had already begun to show interest in the geopolitical possibilities of overseas trade. In his address to him, Magellan spoke calmly but confidently. He presented a map of the proposed route, explained that he knew of the existence of a southern passage through the New World, referred to rumors of a strait, and assured him that he could lead the Spanish fleet to the Spice Islands without violating the treaty with Portugal. Carlos listened carefully. After consulting with his advisors, among whom were Castilians, Flemings, and Genoese, he gave his consent. In March 1518, the Capitulación de Valladolid, a formal treaty that gave Magellan the right to lead the expedition on behalf of the Spanish crown, was signed. He received the title of Adelante, a promise of a tenth of all profits from the new lands, governmental functions in the open domains, and the status of commander-in-chief. Rui Falero was included in the project as the chief navigational advisor. After signing the agreement, Magellan received Spanish citizenship and became an official figure. He changed his name to the Castilian manner of Fernando de Magallanes and settled in Seville, where he soon began to prepare a flotilla. For now, he had no ships, no crew, no funds. All this was ahead. In the meantime, behind him forever remained the country to which he had given the best years of service, and which turned away from him at the moment when he needed support. After signing the capitulation in Valladolid, Ferdinand Magellan returned to Seville with a mandate that few foreigners had under the Spanish crown. He was now acting in the name of Carlos I, and he had a mandate to equip an expedition to the Maluku Islands from the west, bypassing the territory assigned to Portugal. Over the next few months, he had to assemble a fleet, buy supplies, recruit a crew, obtain astronomical calculations, coordinate financing, and, most importantly, maintain control over a project that was viewed with obvious mistrust by Spanish officials and captains. Seville, where he had settled, had long been the main port of the Costa Rica for transatlantic trade. It was here in the shipyards of the Triana Quarter and in the warehouses along the Guadalquivir embankment that the bustle was in full swing day and night. From here, ships left for America. Loaded ships with cocoa, leather, gold, and letters describing new lands returned here. The people who managed these processes knew the value of discipline, time, and the captain's authority. It was here that Magellan began organizing his fleet. 5 ships were placed at the disposal of the expedition. They were of different sizes, conditions, and seaworthiness. Trinidad, the flagship, was a strong and well-armed vessel on which Magellan himself was going to sail. San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet by tonnage, was capable of transporting supplies and heavy equipment. Conception, a light ship of medium capacity, was suitable for maneuvering. Victoria, a strong-looking caravel, would later acquire a unique fate, and Santiago, the smallest ship in the flotilla, was suitable for reconnaissance of coastal areas. The ships were in different technical condition. It was necessary to replace part of the rigging, check the hull, prepare new sails, and purchase barrels in which to store water, vinegar, and salted products. At the same time, purchases of provisions were made. Salinina, crackers, butter, rice, wine, as well as numerous items intended for the exchange of cobregions, booze, knives, axes, copper bells, and bright fabrics. Everything had to be taken into account, checked, and stored in the cargo holds according to a pre-approved order. The composition of the team was formed with difficulty. The Castilian sailors were not eager to sail under the command of a foreigner. It was necessary to recruit people from different provinces. Andalusians, Basques, Galicians, Flemings, Italians, as well as several Portuguese who, like Magellan, were in exile. Among them were both volunteers and convicts who received the right to pardon in exchange for service. The total crew eventually numbered about 240 men. Particularly alarming was the behavior of some of the captains appointed by the Council of the Indies. Juan de Cartagena, who commanded the San Antonio, was not just a captain, but a virtual observer for the crown, and his arrogant attitude toward Magellan was noticeable from the start. Gaspar de Quesada and Luis de Mendoza, who led the other ships, were also of the opinion that the leading role in the expedition should belong to the Castilians. None of them shared Magellan's plan as their own, and barely concealed their internal opposition. The mental state of Ruy Falero, who was initially appointed second in command of the expedition, led to his dismissal. He suffered from fits of rage and deep depression, and Magellan, realizing the impossibility of sailing together, decided to remain the sole commander. This deprived him of an ally, but gave him the necessary full authority. Magellan personally participated in the inspections, negotiations, and selection of officers. He hired several experienced helmsmen, including Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian, who would later be called the expedition's chief chronicler. Among the sailors was Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque, a former merchant ship commander who had fallen into debt and was looking for a way to rehabilitate himself. At that time, his role was modest, and he was not listed on the staff, but Magellan knew of his experience and kept him in mind as a reserve officer. Navigational instruments were purchased from Casadella Contrada. There were pictographs, compasses, quadrants, hourglasses, and maps, both publicly known and secret, intended only for the highest command staff. Considering that unknown seas had to be crossed, special attention was paid to accuracy. Mistakes in the calculation of the route were unacceptable. In August 1519, the flotilla left Seville and moved slowly down the Guadalquivir. The crew slept on the decks. The ships waited for the tides. In Sanlúcar, Barrameda, they stayed for almost a month until the last checks were completed and the weather became favorable for going out to sea. It was here, at the mouth of the river, that Magellan held his last conference with the captains. There were no threats in his voice, but there was firmness. He spoke of duty, of the trust of the crown, of the value of the life of each sailor, but also of the discipline without which the journey was impossible. The reaction was cold. Several officers listened in silence without speaking. The internal resistance did not disappear. It simply went deep. And yet, on the morning of September 20th, 1519, to the sounds of prayer and the ringing of bells, under the gaze of the townspeople gathered on the shore, 5 ships, one after the other, having separated from the pier, set off towards the ocean. The flags of the Castilla were fluttering on the masts. In the holds lay bales of flour, ropes, weapons, and barrels of water. On board were people whose names history had not yet known, and only one of them knew to what end of the earth he was heading. When 5 ships, under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, left Sanlúcar de Barrameda and went out into the Atlantic Ocean, none of those who stood on the decks then knew that the journey would take almost 3 years and lead to the first circumnavigation in history. In the first weeks, everything went well. The wind was favorable, there was enough food, the flotilla kept a compact formation, and the sailors, not yet tired of the cramped holds and the monotony of food, maintained their fighting spirit. The ships sailed along the southern coast of Africa and then crossed the Atlantic. Already in November, the expedition reached the shores of South America. In early December, they entered a picturesque bay, located at the mouth of a river that would later be called Rio de Janeiro. There, Magellan allowed them to stop. The ships were anchored. The crews had the opportunity to rest, make minor repairs, replenish their supplies of fresh water and fresh food. Trade with the locals was lively. Knives, mirrors, and fabrics were exchanged for fruits, meat, fish, and wood. The atmosphere seemed almost as peaceful as it was possible during such a trip. After Rio, the fleet continued its journey south. In January 1520, they explored the mouth of La Plata, hoping to find a passage to the west there. Geographical features, a wide bay, brackish water, and a powerful current, inspired hope. But it soon became clear that this was not a strait, but another dead end in the water. Disappointed, Magellan ordered them to continue along the coast, now into the little-known southern latitudes, where the coastline became increasingly rugged, the winds harsh, and the weather unstable. In March, with the onset of autumn in the southern hemisphere, the expedition reached a deep and sheltered bay that would later be named San Julian. Here, realizing that further advance in the face of increasing storms would lead to losses, Magellan decided to stop for the winter. The decision was reasonable, but did not arouse unanimous support. The cold inactivity, lack of fresh food, and general exhaustion increased irritation, and the accumulating discontent with Magellan's authority began to take more organized forms. The main instigators were Juan de Cartagena, captain of San Antonio, Gaspar de Quesada, commander of the Conception, and Luis de Mendoza, captain of Victoria. Cartagena had already shown open disloyalty, insisting that Magellan, as a Portuguese, could not dispose of the Spanish ships alone. Now, taking advantage of the temporary isolation in the bay, he began to act more decisively. During the night, the mutineers raised the banner of disobedience. Cartagena's and Quesada's ships refused to obey orders, and on Victoria, Mendoza effectively removed the senior officer loyal to Magellan. Magellan, despite the fact that he remained with two ships, Trinidad and Santiago, acted decisively. He did not wait for events to develop, but organized a rapid capture of Victoria. On the night of April 1st to 2nd, officers loyal to him, including Juan Sebastián and Gamosa d'Espinosa, boarded the ship with armed men and caught the mutineers by surprise. Mendoza was killed while attempting to resist, and control of Victoria passed to Magellan. This was the turning point. Control of Victoria allowed him to restore balance of power. The next day, with the help of a surprise attack and threats of artillery, the remaining ships were also returned to control. Cartagena and Quesada were arrested. A court-martial was convened to examine the circumstances of the mutiny. Gaspar de Quesada was found guilty of armed rebellion and sentenced to death. He was beheaded on the beach near the camp during a general formation of the crew. Cartagena, because of his connections with the Council of the Indies, Magellan spared him, but ordered him to be put ashore in a deserted place, without the possibility of returning, along with the priest who also supported the mutiny. Their subsequent fate remains unknown. After the suppression of the mutiny, Magellan restored strict order. He re-evaluated the loyalty of the officers, abolished previous agreements, established a strict hierarchy, and tightened discipline. The entire crew swore allegiance to him as supreme commander. It was a risky but necessary step. Without unity of command, the expedition had no chance of surviving further trials, and yet the trials continued. Soon after these events, it was decided to send Santiago to explore the southern coast. The ship left the bay, but got caught in a storm and crashed near the rocks. The crew survived and, having walked dozens of kilometers, were found and brought back to the camp. The loss of the ship became a reminder. Every mistake in these latitudes could cost the lives of the entire expedition. Magellan did not know where the strait was. He did not know whether it would be found. But, having waited until spring, when the ice began to recede and the weather improved, he gave the order to prepare the fleet for departure. At the end of October, the ships weighed anchor, and the expedition again headed south to unknown coasts, where, as he hoped, the way to the great ocean opened. When, at the end of October, the 4 remaining ships under the command of Magellan left the Bay of San Julian and moved south again, spring had arrived. But the southern latitudes still greeted the travelers with sharp winds, snow, and piercing dampness. One ship had been lost earlier during reconnaissance, and San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and the flagship Trinidad moved with difficulty along a steep, gloomy coast that seemed to have no end. Tension was growing among the officers. More than a year had passed since sailing from Spain. Supplies were dwindling, and the promised strait connecting the two oceans had still not been found. On October 21st, the ships approached a section of the coast where a high cape formed a narrow entrance to the bay. From the top of the mast which the navigator climbed, a bend in the water was noticed going far inland. Magellan, after a brief conference with his officers, gave the order to enter. He believed that this might be the passage he had been waiting for, a connection between the Atlantic Ocean and other seas known only by guesswork. What had at first seemed like an ordinary bay soon turned into a tortuous, rocky, and changeable strait, the shores of which were devoid of any signs of life. The slopes rose steeply, the stone cliffs cast long shadows on the gray water, and the wind, tearing off the peaks, carried sharp gusts, interfering with the management of the sails. Despite the danger, the flotilla moved forward. The strait sometimes narrowed, sometimes widened again. Between the bends, side bays, branches, and islets appeared. The travelers were forced to constantly stop, lower the boats, measure the depths, and look for a safe passage. Several times the ships were forced to split up. Some remained in the main channel, others checked the side passages. In this situation, one of the most difficult episodes of the expedition, the desertion of San Antonio, occurred. The ship was commanded by Juan de Cartagena, but in fact, it was controlled by the helmsman Esteban Gomez, an experienced sailor secretly opposed to Magellan. Taking advantage of the moment when the other ships were temporarily out of sight, Gomez gave the order to turn around. San Antonio left the strait and went into the open ocean, heading back to Spain. On board were maps, documents, records, everything that could reveal the plan of the expedition. This was not just an escape, it was a betrayal that threatened not only the fate of the fleet, but also the political support of the project on the part of the crown. Magellan learned of the desertion a few days later. When San Antonio did not appear at the agreed meeting place, he did not undertake a search. The situation called for caution. The remaining ships continued their journey along the winding, treacherous channel. The crossing took almost 38 days. The men worked to the limit of their strength, managed the sails in a crosswind, climbed ashore for reconnaissance, conducted surveillance, and drew up plans for the passage. The width of the strait varied from 2 to 5 kilometers. The depths were inconsistent, the current strong and unpredictable. Sometimes the water rose sharply, and the ships were forced to wait in bays. On other days, fogs hid the direction of travel, and only the experience of the helmsman allowed them to avoid collisions with reefs. Exhaustion grew among the sailors. Some began to suffer from fever caused by dampness and cold. Frostbite, weakness, quarrels in the holds, and hysterics on deck became more and more frequent. Magellan, contrary to the legends about his aloofness, was active. He went around the ships, participated in meetings, gave personal instructions to the navigators, and encouraged the officers. He understood that if the men broke down now, halfway across the strait, everything would be lost. And yet, at the end of November, another sea opened up ahead. On November 28th, the ships passed the last rocky edge. Beyond it was the horizon. Smooth, quiet, without storms and thunderstorms. The sailors, accustomed over the past weeks to squalls, icy ropes, and pitching, felt a steady wind and smooth, stable water for the first time in a long time. This was a different ocean. Magellan, standing on the stern of his flagship, Trinidad, was silent for a long time. He looked at the boundless blue without interrupting it with either a command or a speech. Only after a while did he pronounce the name Mar Pacifica, the Pacific Ocean, not because it was calm in essence, but because after the mutiny, the wrecks, and the betrayal, the very idea of calm seemed a miracle. No one knew that ahead lay not days, as they had hoped, but long and painful months. But at that moment, the victory was complete. The strait had been found, passed, and crossed for the first time in history. Then began the Great Ocean. When the 3 remaining ships left the southern strait, discovered by Magellan, and moved west, a new, most difficult stage of the voyage began. Not a battle with the enemy, Not a fight with the storm, but a test of time, silence, and exhaustion, which slowly and mercilessly undermined every ship and every man. At first, everything seemed favorable. The waters of the new ocean turned out to be unusually calm. No hurricanes, no squalls, no high waves. The wind blew steadily, the course was held confidently, and the sailors, accustomed to the vagaries of the Atlantic and the strait, took this silence for a good sign. For the first week, everything went as well as possible. The ships kept a westerly course, expecting to reach the Maluku Islands in a month. But with each passing day, it became more obvious. No birds, no clouds, no smells of land, nothing that could mean the earth was close. The sun was high, the heat was increasing, fresh water was spoiling, and food supplies were decreasing faster than expected. Problems began with provisions. Barrels of salted beef began to rot from heat, humidity, and time. The bread had long since run out. The flour had become scoured. People ate everything that retained at least the semblance of food. Dried fish, leftover rice, boiled skins, crumbs of hard cheese. Later, according to Antonio Pigafetta, the sailors boiled sawdust, softened leather, and even rotten sail straps in order to somehow satisfy their hunger. Scurvy began to undermine the crews. First, bleeding gums, then loss of teeth, exhaustion, swelling, and death. Bodies lost strength, fingers went numb, knees buckled under the slightest strain. Every day, 2 or 3 bodies rolled up in canvas were thrown into the sea. On some ships, the sailors were no longer able to perform their duties. They only had enough strength to keep the ship afloat. Officers took over watches, carpenters replaced the helmsmen, and navigators prepared food for the survivors, if it could be called food. And all this in silence. There were no storms, no thunder, no sounds from the shore, only the creaking of masts, the occasional cries of birds, and the breathing of exhausted people. According to Pigafetta, during the entire time they crossed the ocean, they did not see a single large island where they could go ashore. Once, a strip of land appeared on the horizon, but it turned out to be barren and surrounded by sharp reefs. It was not possible to replenish the stock. More than a month passed, then the second. People stopped counting the days. Even the officers lost track of time. The navigators tried to keep track of the course, but the readings began to diverge. The route was calculated manually, based on the ship's speed, the angle of the wind, and the position of the sun. An error of 1 mile a day, in 3 months, turned into hundreds of miles, and no one knew how far it was to the end of the route. Magellan kept a low profile. He continued to act as commander, walked around the decks, talked to the helmsman, and called the officers for short meetings. In public, he showed no doubt. Although, as Pigafetta later wrote, even in the eyes of Captain Trinidad, signs of exhaustion began to appear. He did not resort to severity. On the contrary, he tried to keep the crew in balance not by threat, but by example. He was silent when everyone was silent, and spoke only when it was necessary to encourage or give a clear order. In early March 1521, 3 months and 1 day after leaving the Strait of Magellan, one of the sailors from the Conception shouted, "There's land on the horizon." At first, no one believed it, but an hour later, the outlines of the land were confirmed. It was not a deserted or dangerous island, but a living one, covered in greenery with a beach and springs. People, not believing their eyes, looked at the approaching shore. It was the island of Guam, one of the Mariana Islands. The landing took place immediately. People rushed to the water, drank until they fell on the sand. Coconut palms were cut down, roots were dug, fruits were taken out. In 1 day, the crew regained more strength than in the past weeks. Several people died on the shore. The body could not withstand the abrupt transition from hunger to food, but the rest returned to life. The island turned out to be inhabited, and although the first meeting with the locals was accompanied by misunderstandings and even a conflict over the theft of the boat, it did not develop into a clash. The main things that were important to the team were water, food, and rest, and they got all of this. The greatest transition in the history of navigation was behind them. Without stops, without land, without storms, but with silence and hunger, the Pacific Ocean was crossed from South America to the islands of Asia. But the main thing was still ahead. After a difficult, multi-month voyage across the Pacific Ocean and a short stop on the island of Guam, the 3 remaining ships, under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, headed further west in search of the Maluku Islands. In mid-March 1521, the flotilla approached one of the large islands, later called Samar, and landed on the deserted foliage and palm-covered shore of neighboring Homenhon. Here, on March 16th, the sailors set up a temporary camp to give the exhausted team a rest, collect food, and fix the rigging. It was here that the first meetings with the locals took place. The boat, anchored off the coast, was soon approached by bamboo canoes with islanders, with spears in their hands, but without hostility. The interpreter was Enrique of Malacca, a slave and servant of Magellan, who, as it turned out, understood the language of the locals, or at least could speak a dialect close to their speech. Through him, it became clear that the nearby island of Limasawa was ruled by Raja Kalambu, a respected man, inclined to trade and open to negotiations. Magellan immediately organized the crossing. Raja Kalambu greeted the Europeans in a friendly manner. As a gift, he received fabrics, metal products, and jewelry, and in return offered food, water, and guides. Communication turned to the Union. On March 31st, the first mesa on Philippine soil was celebrated on Limasawa. It was celebrated in the open air, on the shore, in the presence of Europeans and local chiefs. For Magellan, this became a symbol. His expedition not only crossed the ocean for the first time, but also made contact with a new world, not with the sword, but with words. From Limasawa, the fleet headed for the island of Cebu, a densely populated, trading, and politically significant island. Here, Raja Humabon, an influential and pragmatic man, ruled. Magellan understood that in order to succeed in the expedition and consolidate Spanish influence in the archipelago, he needed to enlist the support of the local elite. He arranged a ceremonial reception, demonstrated artillery and muskets, and presented weapons, fabrics, mirrors, and jewelry. Humabon, impressed by the technological superiority of the Europeans and seeking to strengthen his position among the other chiefs, agreed not only to an alliance, but also to baptism. On April 14th, Raja Humabon was baptized under the name Carlos and his wife as Juana in honor of the Spanish royal couple. About 800 people followed them. A wooden cross was erected, a mesa was built, and a feast was held. Magellan believed that the Cebu alliance was now sealed not only by treaty, but also by common faith. But this step had consequences. The influential chief, Lapu-Lapu, ruler of the neighboring island of Mactan, refused to submit to Humabon and rejected Magellan's offer to accept baptism. Moreover, he made it clear that he did not recognize the authority of either Cebu or foreign invaders. Humabon asked Magellan to punish his rebellious neighbor. Magellan, wanting to demonstrate his strength and consolidate his missionary success, agreed. He decided to set out for Mactan, not with the entire flotilla, but with a small force of 50 armed Spaniards and a small number of Cebu allies. Confident that one sudden appearance would be enough, he did not take into account the terrain. On April 27th, early in the morning, the detachment approached the shore of the island, but the ships were unable to get very close. Reefs and shallow waters did not allow the use of artillery. The Spaniards were forced to disembark in heavy armor under the scorching sun. And already a few hundred meters from the shore, they encountered several hundred well-armed Lapu-Lapu warriors who had prepared for defense in advance. At first, Magellan gave commands calmly, urging them not to shoot unnecessarily. He hoped for a quick intimidation, but the attack stalled. The allies from Cebu retreated. The Spaniards, who found themselves in shallow water, where armor impeded movement, began to lose formation. Lapu-Lapu, taking advantage of numbers and maneuverability, surrounded the enemy. A merciless battle began. Magellan, who remained in the ranks, covered the retreat. He fought with a sword, was wounded in the leg, lost his balance, and falling into the water, became an easy target. He was surrounded. According to eyewitnesses, he did not ask for mercy, but he could no longer retreat. One after another, spears and swords pierced his body. The Spaniards were unable to pull him out. They were driven to the boats. Magellan's body remained on the shore. A few days later, Humabon offered a ransom, but Lapu-Lapu refused to return the remains. Thus ended the life of Ferdinand Magellan, a man who walked from the shores of Portugal to the other side of the world, discovered a strait, crossed the Pacific Ocean, and was the first European to enter into an alliance with the peoples of the East. He died not in a storm, not from illness, but on a foreign shore, in battle, in armor among people for whom he was a conqueror, not a messenger of faith. But his journey was not interrupted. The flotilla remained. There were those who still hoped to return, and there was only one goal: to complete the circle. After Magellan's death off the coast of Mactan Island, the expedition found itself in a state of deep confusion. The flotilla had lost not only its commander, but also the only authority that united the disparate crew, keeping discipline, the route, and the meaning of the entire adventure under control. For several days, the remaining officers tried to establish contact with Humabon, hoping that the Cebu alliance would be preserved. But the reality was much harsher. On May 1st, 1521, during a banquet held on the shore, a massacre began at a signal from the hosts. About 27 people were killed, including the commanders of Trinidad and Concepcion. Those on board managed to raise anchor in time and leave the harbor. The ships were damaged, the crew was exhausted, and the situation was critical. They had no leader, no supplies, and no clear route. It was decided to burn Concepcion, since there were not enough people to operate all 3 ships. The fire engulfed the empty deck on May 2nd, and the flotilla was reduced to 2 ships. Command passed to Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque, an experienced helmsman who had not shone in the previous months, but who managed to keep his cool. He was chosen not by title, but by trust. He knew the sea, was a good listener, and spoke little. He proposed not to return back across the Pacific, but to complete the mission, to reach the Maluku Islands, buy spices, and return home by another route around Africa. In November, the 2 remaining ships reached one of the key Maluku Islands, Tidera. The local sultan, Al-Mansur, who was at odds with the Portuguese, welcomed the Spaniards as allies. Having concluded an agreement, the expedition was able not only to replenish the supplies, but also to load both ships with sacks of cloves, the most valuable commodity of the East. For about a month, Victoria and Trinidad stood in the roadstead. The crew was loaded, patched up, and treated. When the time came to return, a fateful decision was made. Victoria would go west across the Indian Ocean, and Trinidad would go east back across the Pacific Ocean, a decision that, despite the deterioration of her hull, proved fatal. Trinidad, caught in a series of storms, lost her masts, began to sink, and was captured by the Portuguese garrison in May 1522. The crew was taken prisoner. Many were sent to Malacca, some to Goa, and only a few were able to return to Europe years later. Victoria, now the expedition's only hope, set out for home in December with a crew of 47 Europeans and about 13 Asian assistants. Elcano chose the Indian Ocean route, keeping the ship offshore to avoid Portuguese possessions. The voyage was long, grueling, and virtually endless. The wind died down and then turned into a hurricane. Food supplies were quickly spoiling, water was running out, and diseases, especially scurvy, spared no one. They did not call at Muscat, Mozambique, or any other possible ports, fearing arrest. Only in Cape Verde, on Portuguese territory, did they land secretly, calling themselves traders who had been caught in a storm. But the ruse was discovered, and part of the crew was detained. Elcano, without waiting for them, raised the sails. The ship was worn out to the limit, and any delay could cost the lives of those who remained. On September 6, 1522, At the end of the hot Andalusian summer, Victoria slowly entered the harbor of Seville. Of the entire expedition, which began with 5 ships, only 18 Europeans and 4 Asians returned. They were met not by orchestras or crowds, but by amazement and silence. Many thought that the expedition would never be heard of again. The ship, whose sails were stitched hundreds of times and whose hull creaked with every gust of wind, delivered to Spain about 26 tons of cloves, enough cargo to cover the expenses of the entire expedition. But the most valuable cargo was not the bags, but the people, their diaries, maps, notes, astronomical observations, and knowledge that had previously existed only in conjecture. The world really is round and can be circumnavigated. Thus ended the journey begun under the Spanish flag, led by a Portuguese and completed by a Basque. Exhausted, aged, and silent, the people who returned became living proof of the impossible. When Victoria entered Seville, the few who survived the 3 years of travel stepped ashore not with triumph in their eyes, but with fatigue in their movements and silence in their voices. Their bodies were emaciated, their faces scarred by scurvy, their movements slow, like those of men whose existence had long depended on water in barrels and wind in sails. They had not returned as heroes of songs, but as witnesses to an event that had forever changed mankind's understanding of its own planet. Their arrival was not accompanied by grand speeches or ceremonies. At the harbor, they were met by officials of the Seville Chamber of the Indies and representatives of the Crown. First, they were placed under surveillance to verify the authenticity of their stories and to assess the goods they were transporting. Then came hours of interrogation, recording, and retelling of the route. First for the trade departments, later for the imperial court. Juan Sebastián Elcano was invited to Valladolid, where Charles V presented him with a personal coat of arms depicting the globe and the Latin motto Primus circumdediste me. You are the first to circle me. With this award, he received a pension confirmed by royal decree. However, Elcano's health was undermined, and a few years later he died during a new naval campaign in the southern latitudes of the Pacific Ocean before reaching old age. Of the 11 returning Spaniards, many soon parted with life, not so much from the wounds they received, but from illness, malnutrition, and internal exhaustion. Those who survived became the objects of questioning and observation for many years. Some, like Francesco Alba, continued their naval careers. Others dispersed, returning to obscurity. One of the few who left behind a detailed account was Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian who accompanied the expedition as a representative of the spiritual knightly order. Pigafetta kept records almost from the very beginning of the campaign, but upon his return, he formalized them into a consistent, almost diary-like account. His manuscript, written in Italian and later translated into French, became one of the most important historical sources on the Age of Discovery. Thanks to his work, Europeans received for the first time a systematic description of the peoples of the Philippines, the Maluku Islands, and Oceania. The geographical consequences of the expedition were not immediately assessed, but over the next decades they became obvious. The globe, previously populated by conventions and hypotheses, now became a space that could be measured not only by imagination, but by routes and coordinates. The ocean ceased to be an edge. It became a corridor. After the Victoria voyage, it became clear that the East could be reached by moving west. For Spain, the expedition was a symbolic victory over Portugal and an economic precedent. Let some of the ships perish, and half of the crew never return. The delivery of cloves in the hold of one, Victoria compensated for almost all the money invested. However, the most important result was the strategic advantage, the discovery of a route, albeit dangerous but possible, to the riches of the East. The Portuguese, having learned of the completion of the circumnavigation, reacted painfully. The following year, they captured Trinidad and its crew, later sending people to Goa. They intensified naval patrols along the East African coast, and obtained confirmation of their rights to the Maluku Islands from the Pope. The conflict between the two maritime powers continued until the conclusion of the Treaty of Zaragoza, which temporarily delimited spheres of influence. An important change occurred in the worldview. What had previously seemed like a theory was now proven by action. The world map became coherent. A long, grueling, death-filled, but real path appeared. It became the route for future explorers, traders, scientists, and cartographers. The name of Magellan, despite the fact that he himself did not return, became a symbol of the journey that ended without him, but was started by him. His death on the island of Mactan, his quarrel with the Portuguese king, his stubbornness, faith, and cruelty, all this merged into the image of a figure whose influence was stronger than his physical presence. A strait in South America was named after him, 2 star clouds in the southern hemisphere, and most importantly, the idea that the Earth is one and can be passed through in its entirety. Magellan's expedition was not just an event of the era, it became a line. Before it, the world was fragmented and conditional. After it, it became measurable, passable, and connected by seas. This was not the end of geographical discoveries, but their point of no return.